For decades, they smiled on stage together. Porter Wagoner, the glittering showman of country music, and Norma Jean, the angel-voiced beauty America adored. Their chemistry lit up television screens, and fans believed it was all picture-perfect. But behind the sequins and soft harmonies, something was unraveling. Quiet looks, tense silences, and eventually, a devastating exit. Norma Jean left the spotlight as suddenly as she had entered it. Whispers followed for years about control, heartbreak, and betrayal. Now, at 87 years old, Norma Jean is finally breaking her silence. And what she says about Porter Wagoner will change everything you thought you knew. Norma Jean Beasler didn't come from privilege or connections. She was born in the small town of Wellston, Oklahoma, in 1938, raised on faith, hard work, and the simple poetry of country songs playing on dusty radios. By the age of 12, she was singing on local stations. By 16, her voice had become her escape, soft but powerful, filled with sincerity. In an era when female artists were often treated as side acts, Norma Jean demanded attention with her natural phrasing and heartfelt delivery. She wasn't trying to be anyone else. She was just herself, and that was enough. In the 1950s, she caught the eye of country legend Red Foley, who invited her to join the Ozark Jubilee. It was a big break, but not without its challenges. Men dominated the stage. Women were often given 2 songs, a smile, and a pat on the head. But Norma Jean's presence couldn't be ignored. She sang with conviction, her every word dripping with quiet heartbreak or down-home joy. Fans adored her, and soon, so did Porter Wagoner. In 1961, Porter invited Norma Jean to join him on his new television venture, The Porter Wagoner Show. It was an offer that promised national exposure. For Norma Jean, it was a dream wrapped in rhinestones. The set was colorful, the format fast-paced, and the viewership staggering. Every week, millions of Americans tuned in to see the tall, glitter-suited Wagoner and the beautiful, humble young woman by his side. Their chemistry was instant, on screen at least. Porter played the charming host. Norma Jean played the grounded sweetheart. She sang gospel songs that made audiences cry and classic country ballads that became hits. Her rendition of Go Cat Go and Let's Go All the Way put her on the charts. But there was something deeper happening off-camera, something no fan could see. Norma Jean later admitted she felt torn during those years. On one hand, she was living her dream. On the other, she was becoming part of someone else's vision. Porter made most of the decisions, what she sang, how she dressed, even when she spoke. He was protective, yes, but also possessive. She was grateful, but she also felt boxed in. She had come to be known as Porter's girl, and while it brought fame, it slowly chipped away at her identity. Still, she gave everything to the show. Fans sent letters in droves. The Grand Ole Opry came calling. She was nominated for awards, and yet, beneath the surface, cracks had started to form. People close to the production sensed it. Norma Jean wasn't just tired. She was beginning to question everything. Years later, when asked why she stayed so long, she simply said, "I didn't know I could leave." And in that single sentence, you could hear all the pain of a young woman trapped between gratitude and silence. To the public, Porter Wagoner was a beacon of country hospitality. Flashy suits, big smiles, and a voice that sounded like the heartland itself. But behind that polished image was a man deeply driven by control, routine, and an obsession with perfection. On the Porter Wagoner Show, everything moved to his rhythm. And Norma Jean? She was expected to keep in step. Wagoner wasn't just the star. He was the architect of the entire production. He chose the musical arrangements, the guests, the running order. He even had a say in the camera angles. It was his show in every sense of the word. And for anyone working under him, especially a young female co-star, that meant towing the line. Norma Jean was grateful for the exposure, but soon she realized she wasn't just Porter's singing partner. She was part of his brand, a well-curated fixture. Norma Jean recalled how her wardrobe, song choices, and even how much she spoke during tapings were controlled. She wanted to experiment, try writing more of her own material, show a different side of herself. But Porter resisted. "People want to see the Norma they know," he would say. But the Norma he wanted the world to see wasn't necessarily the Norma she truly was. As the months turned into years, the control deepened. Off camera, Porter would grow irritated if she didn't take his advice. She began to sense that her success came with strings. If she pushed too hard or stepped outside his vision, she was met with coldness or subtle punishment. Fewer songs, less camera time, private lectures cloaked as mentorship. In interviews decades later, Norma Jean described feeling like she was in a cage made of gold. Everything looked beautiful, but she wasn't free. And slowly, her spirit began to shrink. Porter rarely raised his voice, but the quiet ways he enforced control, his silence, his dismissals, his ability to ice someone out without explanation, cut just as deep. Colleagues on the show began to notice. Norma Jean, once so full of energy, became more withdrawn between takes. The joy in her voice was still there, but her eyes started to look distant. One crew member recalled, she'd come off stage smiling, but the moment she was out of the spotlight, she looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. Yet through all this, Norma Jean never publicly complained. She respected Porter, even admired his talent. But admiration can't erase unease. She found herself living in his shadow, elevated by his success, but dimmed by his need to control everything around him. And still, she stayed. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was the dream she had fought so hard to reach. But as the years passed, the cost of that silence would become heavier. The curtain Porter kept so tightly drawn was starting to feel suffocating. And Norma Jean began to wonder, if she didn't take back her voice soon, would she lose it forever? By the mid-1960s, the Porter Wagoner Show was one of the most watched programs in country music television. Every week, millions tuned in to see Porter's polished introductions, the flashy suits, and the harmonious blend of voices between him and Norma Jean. But behind the perfect harmonies, something more complicated was unfolding, something people only whispered about. Rumors of a relationship between Porter and Norma Jean had begun to circulate. Neither confirmed it publicly. Both insisted it was strictly professional. But the energy between them said otherwise. Off camera, their exchanges were charged, sometimes warm, sometimes tense. Norma Jean later admitted there was emotional entanglement, though she chose her words carefully. She didn't accuse, she didn't blame, but she also didn't deny the connection. Porter was married during the show's early run, and although estranged from his wife, he maintained the image of a faithful family man. For Norma Jean, this blurred line between admiration and dependence became increasingly difficult to navigate. She cared for him, deeply even, but she also began to feel like a secret, a kept woman in a world where women like her weren't supposed to speak up. There were frequent disagreements, some quiet, some loud. Crew members recalled seeing Norma Jean emerge from dressing rooms with red eyes. Others noticed Porter's mood shift instantly if she challenged one of his decisions. A missed note, a forgotten cue, small mistakes from Norma Jean seemed to be magnified. Some days, their banter was playful. Other days, they didn't speak at all. And yet, on stage, the chemistry remained electric. It was part of the tension. Audiences saw a dynamic duo. What they didn't see was the quiet power struggle behind the scenes. Norma Jean wasn't just another singer. She had ambition, ideas, a creative soul aching to be more than a background harmony. But every time she pushed for autonomy, she was reminded, subtly or directly, that this was Porter's world. Industry insiders began to talk. Some claimed Porter promised Norma Jean more, bigger roles, more songwriting credits, maybe even a deeper personal commitment. Others say she hoped for it, but was met with vague assurances. No one could confirm the full truth. Only that Norma Jean was changing. Her voice was still pure, but her presence grew more fragile. And then came the turning point. Norma Jean asked for more control over her music. She wanted to record songs that spoke to her own experiences, not just what the show demanded. Porter hesitated. The request wasn't outrageous, but it threatened the balance he had built. He preferred structure. He preferred control. And when that was challenged, things began to unravel. As the studio lights flickered on and off each week, the relationship between Norma Jean and Porter slowly fractured behind the scenes. Their smiles were still there. The performances never faltered. But the gap between them had widened. What had once been mutual respect had turned into a quiet power struggle, with Norma Jean's future hanging in the balance. And soon, she'd make the hardest decision of her life, one that would shock her fans and leave country music forever changed. In 1967, Norma Jean stood at a crossroads, and she made a decision that stunned the country music world. After 6 years as the beloved co-star of the Porter Wagoner show, she announced her departure. There was no scandal in the press, no long-winded explanation, just a brief goodbye and a quiet disappearance from the stage she had helped define. To fans, it seemed sudden. To those closest to the show, it felt inevitable. Norma Jean had reached her limit. The control, the whispers, the emotional exhaustion, it all weighed on her. Though she had great affection for the music and gratitude for the platform, she no longer felt like an artist. She felt like an accessory, seen, heard, but not truly free. She later described her exit not as a rebellion, but as an escape. "I was young," she said, in a rare interview years later. "I didn't know how to fight for myself, so I just left." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was final. And just like that, she was gone. Within weeks, Porter had replaced her. A young, wide-eyed singer named Dolly Parton stepped into the spotlight, and into Norma Jean's place. The torch had been passed, though no one said it out loud. For Norma Jean, it was like watching someone else walk into a life she had fought to build. Porter didn't speak publicly about the change. He thanked Norma Jean for her time, praised Dolly's potential, and moved on. The show continued. The ratings remained strong, and the industry shifted its focus to the next rising star. But in private, the suddenness of Norma Jean's exit was a wound that never fully healed for either of them. Norma Jean stepped back from the mainstream, choosing a quieter path. She continued recording music, but without the same spotlight or support. The industry that had once adored her moved on quickly, but she didn't regret leaving. She knew what staying would have cost her. "I had to go," she once said. "Not because I didn't love it, but because I didn't love myself anymore in that space." To fans, her departure remained a mystery for decades. Why would someone at the peak of her success walk away? The answer, Norma Jean now says, is simple: freedom. Not just from Porter, not just from television, but from a system that asked women to smile, sing sweetly, and never step out of line. It was the end of an era for Norma Jean, for the show, and for a version of country music that preferred its women silent and smiling. But it was also the beginning of something else, the long, quiet journey toward reclaiming her story. Because while the world moved on, Norma Jean never forgot when Dolly Parton stepped onto the set of the Porter Wagoner show in late 1967. She entered not just a TV studio, but a vacuum. Norma Jean's absence was fresh. The cameras rolled on, but behind the scenes, there was tension. The fans hadn't yet accepted Dolly. And Porter? He wasn't just bringing in a new voice. He was trying to replace a presence that had defined the show for 6 years. From the moment she appeared, Dolly was met with resistance. Viewers sent angry letters demanding Norma Jean's return. Audiences booed Dolly during early live performances. To them, Norma Jean hadn't just been a singer. She was their girl, the voice of comfort, tradition, and grace. Anyone who followed her was stepping into a storm, but Porter stood firm. He saw something in Dolly: youth, ambition, and a drive that mirrored his own. She was moldable, just like Norma Jean had been. And once again, he tried to shape the story, to guide the show's new chapter on his terms. But Dolly was different. Norma Jean watched this all from a distance. She had stepped out of the spotlight, but she couldn't ignore what was happening. In Dolly, she saw echoes of herself, the same bright-eyed enthusiasm, the same desire to succeed, the same delicate position under Porter's influence. And as Dolly rose to fame, Norma Jean felt a mix of pride and pain. She knew exactly what it took to stand beside Porter Wagoner, and what it could cost. Over time, Dolly's star grew. Porter pushed her into duets, featured her in skits, and managed her career. But unlike Norma Jean, Dolly fought for her independence. She wrote her own songs. She pushed back when boundaries were crossed. And eventually, their partnership collapsed in a famously bitter split, one that mirrored, in many ways, the quiet fracture that had happened years earlier with Norma Jean. For Norma Jean, it was like watching history repeat, only louder this time. The things she had endured quietly, Dolly would confront publicly. Lawsuits were filed. Accusations were made. Porter became a cautionary tale of what happens when mentorship crosses lines into possession. Still, Norma Jean never spoke ill of Dolly. In fact, she admired her. She once said, "Dolly did what I couldn't." She told him no. It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. Norma Jean had paved the way, but Dolly had walked it differently. And in doing so, she exposed what Norma Jean had been too afraid or too conditioned to say out loud. To this day, some fans pit them against each other. Norma Jean, the graceful original. Dolly, the outspoken successor. But the reality is far more layered. They were two women in the same machine, two voices shaped by the same man. One silenced, the other defiant. And as Dolly soared to superstardom, Norma Jean remained in the background, watching, remembering, and waiting for the moment when she, too, could finally speak her truth. After leaving the Porter Wagoner show, Norma Jean stepped away from the fame she once thought she'd never live without. She retreated from the bright lights, the packed auditoriums, and the non-stop production schedules. For the first time in years, she could breathe. But with that freedom came something unexpected: silence. A quiet so deep it forced her to face everything she had pushed aside during her rise. In the years that followed, Norma Jean kept singing, but not on television. She recorded gospel albums, made small appearances at churches and community events, and focused on her personal faith. Fame no longer fueled her. Survival did. Emotional survival. Identity. Healing. She no longer had to be Porter's girl. Now she had to figure out who Norma Jean really was. But Nashville didn't wait for her. The industry moved on, rewriting country music history without her name at the center. While Porter maintained his platform and Dolly ascended to superstardom, Norma Jean became a footnote. The voice that once commanded standing ovations was now rarely mentioned in retrospectives. For decades, she stayed mostly silent, never seeking headlines, never telling her side. Not because she couldn't, because she wasn't ready. That silence finally began to break in the 1990s and early 2000s. Slowly, in interviews and private conversations, Norma Jean started opening up, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She spoke about her time on the show, about the control she endured, and about the emotional toll it took to always be what someone else needed her to be. "I didn't realize how much I'd given up," she said in one interview. "Not until I was gone." She didn't paint herself as a victim. She didn't accuse Porter of anything criminal or scandalous. But she was honest about the emotional pressure, about the possessiveness, about how hard it was to leave, not just the show, but the idea that her worth was tied to being someone else's creation. "I was a different woman back then," she said. "You didn't speak out. You just smiled and did your job." But now, in her later years, Norma Jean wanted her story told. Not for fame, not for revenge, but for truth. She understood that by speaking, she wasn't just reclaiming her past. She was shining a light for younger artists who still face the same quiet pressures. Her words resonated deeply with a new generation of fans, especially women in country music who had long been told to stay in line, smile, and sing sweetly. Suddenly, Norma Jean wasn't just a former TV star. She was a voice of experience, of caution, of quiet resilience. She started receiving long overdue honors, inductions into state music halls of fame, tributes from younger artists, standing ovations at Opry reunions. But perhaps the greatest gift wasn't public. It was personal. Norma Jean had found her voice again, and this time, no one else was writing her script. When Porter Wagoner passed away in 2007, he was remembered as a country music icon. The rhinestone suits, the syndicated show, the countless duets, he had shaped a generation of sound. But as the tributes poured in, so did a quiet reconsideration of his legacy, especially among the women who stood beside him. Norma Jean had once been Porter's brightest co-star, but she knew the price of standing in his spotlight. He was brilliant, charming, and deeply controlling. She didn't seek to tear down his memory, only to balance it. "He helped me rise," she said, "but he also held the reins tight." Her reflections mirrored others, like Dolly Parton, who later endured a legal battle with Porter after trying to leave his management. The same possessiveness Norma Jean quietly escaped. Dolly publicly fought. Different women, same pattern. Over time, more people began to see the full picture. Porter gave opportunities, but often at the cost of creative freedom. He opened doors, but set boundaries that benefited him most. His mentorship, though real, came with expectations, often unspoken, sometimes suffocating. Norma Jean's voice, once muted, now echoes louder in retrospect. She doesn't ask the world to cancel Porter. She simply asks for honesty. That behind the fame and sparkle was a man who changed country music. And the women in it. At 87, Norma Jean isn't chasing the spotlight. She's reclaiming something deeper. Her voice. Her truth. After decades of letting others define her, first as Porter's protégé, then as Dolly's predecessor, she's finally telling her own story. Not to accuse, but to explain. Not to relive the past, but to release it. She speaks gently, without bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that only time can bring. She recalls how the spotlight once felt like a dream, until she realized it came with invisible chains. Porter Wagoner gave her fame, yes, but also limitations. A stage, but not freedom. A voice, but only on his terms. Walking away was painful. The world didn't understand. She was at her peak. Why leave? But Norma Jean knew, if she stayed, she'd lose herself completely. In choosing to leave, she chose her peace. And in the years since, she's quietly rebuilt herself, far from the stage lights, but closer to who she truly is. Today, younger artists look to her as more than a former star. She's a symbol of silent strength. A woman who left before leaving was acceptable. A trailblazer who didn't yell, but still made history. Her voice may not top charts anymore, but her truth resonates louder than ever. Because in the end, Norma Jean's greatest legacy isn't just the songs she sang, but the silence she finally broke.